The sharp, metallic click of a can opener forcefully ripping open a cheap tin lid. The heavy, wet sound of concentrated tomato puree plopping into an aluminum pot. The pungent, sweetish smell of hot, boiling vegetables, forever ingrained in the brick walls of factories and reeking of workers' sweat from shifts. This is the sound and smell of routine, of the simple American working class. This is cheap food that helped survive the hardest times and cost mere pennies. And now listen to a completely different sound. The hollow, icy echo of footsteps on ancient French marble. The whistle of cold wind bypassing pointed stone towers. The perfect, ringing silence of an enclosed inner courtyard where neither truck horns nor factory sirens can be heard. This is the Linden Hill Estate. 50 acres of absolute, unattainable luxury in the elite Gladwin area of Pennsylvania. A monumental French Norman castle, reliably hidden from prying eyes behind tall wrought iron gates and the dense crowns of centuries-old trees. The most recognizable and affordable food in the world, the red and white can of soup for a few cents, standing on every kitchen shelf, financed the creation of one of the most arrogant, closed, and elite fortresses of the United States of America. Herein lies the main and cruelest irony of our history. How did a mass product for the poorest segments of the population give birth to one of the most aristocratic fortunes in human history? And how did this colossal fortune ultimately devour itself? We are used to thinking that great business empires collapse under the onslaught of aggressive competitors, ruthless antitrust committees, or global economic crises. But the anatomy of downfall is always much more intimate and prosaic. It all begins in the silence of luxurious living rooms. In April 1989, John Dorrance Jr. died, whom high society knew simply as Jack. He was the unquestioned patriarch of the family, son of the genius chemist who created the concentrated soup technology itself, and the sole guardian of the family's greatness. His death did not just end an entire era of corporate stability. It tore off the heavy lead seals from Pandora's box, releasing greed, long-buried childhood grudges, and cold, ruthless financial calculation. During his lifetime, Jack Dorrance Jr. held the giant empire in a death grip, controlling a stake exceeding 58% of the entire company. But on the day his heart stopped, these decisive percentages passed into the hands of the third generation, into the hands of people who had never stood by boiling industrial vats, did not know the smell of factory steam, and absolutely did not understand the true value of their grandfather's scientific breakthrough. Here begins not a culinary chronicle or a dry corporate summary, but a dark philosophical drama about the nature of capital. This is a classic tragedy about how the third generation, with incredible ease and frightening cruelty, destroys what the first generation created with intellect, and the second preserved through isolation. The empire's founder viewed the soup can as a mechanism of creation, as his personal scientific triumph that turned heavy food into an ideal logistical product. His grandchildren viewed the same company exclusively as a giant, bottomless ATM to which they gained access by right of birth. When the numerous heirs gather in the richly paneled oak rooms of Linden Hill after the funeral, there is no mourning for the lost father hanging in the air. The air physically reeks of multi-billion-dollar cash. The house, which had been built for decades as an impregnable family nest for centuries, the house whose impregnable walls were meant to eternally protect the dynasty from encroachments of the outside world, suddenly turns into the epicenter of a fratricidal war. The psychology of the golden youth is always subject to one destructive law. If you did not pour the concrete into the foundation with your own hands, you will never feel the pain when that foundation starts cracking under your feet. For those who grew up among Norman towers, antique French furniture, and thoroughbred horses, the family business had long lost its sacred primordial meaning. The famous red and white can ceased to be a symbol of genius science's triumph over the laws of nature and economics. It became just a line in a securities portfolio, a heavy asset burdening their personal freedom. The death of Jack Dorrance Jr. did not unite the grieving family, but opened a direct path to a great historical schism. Those who by right of blood should have become guardians of the legacy preferred to dismember that legacy and sell it. This is the inevitable and most terrifying paradox of vast wealth. Colossal fortune, originally created to unite the family and secure its future, ultimately becomes the sole reason why members of that family are ready to ruthlessly destroy each other on the pages of newspapers and in the cold halls of corporate courts. And the grand stone castle of Linden Hill stands in the middle of Pennsylvania as a silent, majestic witness to the impending catastrophe. The perfect fortress, which could not be taken by storm from the outside, began to rapidly rot and crumble from within. At the end of the 19th century, the air in the chemical laboratories of the University of Göttingen smelled of ozone, alcohol, and the cold, sterile purity of absolute science. This was the smell of European intellectual superiority, where the best minds of the era unraveled the mysteries of complex molecular structures. The young American John Thompson Dorrance brilliantly defended his chemistry doctoral dissertation there. The doors to the world's most prestigious academic chairs were wide open before him. A great career in the quiet university offices, far from the dirt, soot, and noise of the emerging industrial era, was predicted for him. But in 1897, John committed an act that seemed absolute madness to his contemporaries. He forever leaves refined academic Europe, returns to the United States of America, and voluntarily descends into the stuffy, reeking of rotting vegetables and damp, rusty iron, factory hell. He begs his own uncle, Arthur Dorrance, who was then running the small canning company of Joseph Campbell in the industrial city of Camden, New Jersey, to take him on for any job. The brilliant scientist with a European diploma agrees to a humiliatingly meager salary of $7.50 per week. He voluntarily exchanges his perfectly clean lab coat for a heavy worker's apron splattered with cheap tomato paste. But this step was not an act of desperation of a failure. It was the cold, genius calculation of a man who was preparing to accomplish the greatest alchemical transformation in the history of the global food industry. In those years, canned soup was an incredibly heavy, bulky, and expensive product, available far from everyone. The main enemy of mass consumption and business profitability was ordinary water. It made up the overwhelming part of the volume of each can. It critically weighed down the cargo. It devoured colossal amounts of money during transportation in freight railroad cars and on cumbersome horse-drawn wagons. John Dorrance looked at the boiling factory vats, not with the eyes of a cook seeking the perfect culinary recipe, but with the cold eyes of a ruthless chemist and calculating logistician. Water has absolutely no taste, reasoned the young doctor of science, so why make the poor buyer pay for the complex and expensive delivery of water when it flows completely free from the tap in any home kitchen? The task was not in cooking, but in rigid molecular deconstruction. Dorrance stood by the vats for days on end, and ultimately developed a unique technological method of evaporating the liquid, allowing the preservation of the original taste and nutritional properties of the ingredients in the form of a thick, dense paste. By removing the heavy water from the recipe, he radically reduced the physical volume of the can. Less tin for packaging production, less space occupied in warehouses, an absolute and multiple reduction in daily transportation costs. This was not the birth of a new dish for the dinner table. This was the birth of the perfect capitalist logistical matrix. The cost of production and delivery fell so rapidly that the company could sell a can of thick, hearty condensed soup for just 10 cents with incredible profit. Here lies the most important philosophical paradox of the nature of wealth, which so often escapes the attention of capital analysts. True, indestructible financial empires, capable of surviving decades and world wars, are rarely built on exclusive luxury items for the elite. They are built on maniacal, mathematically precise optimization of consumption for the poorest. The doctor of science, a refined intellectual with an excellent European education, Dorrance created a mass product for the very bottom of society. For weary factory workers, for exhausted miners, for large families painfully counting every penny a week before payday. The contrast is simply stunning. A man who deeply understood the most complex chemical formulas consciously packaged his intellectual genius into a primitive red and white tin can to cheaply feed the American proletariat. It was this ruthless savings on transportation costs and tin volumes that turned a modest provincial company into an unattainable global monopolist. Soon, John Dorrance bought out his uncle's share, became the sole owner of the entire enterprise, and turned penny savings on delivering ordinary water into an incredible multi-billion-dollar fortune, ultimately becoming significantly richer than many European monarchs. The scientific alchemy was accomplished. The dirty, scorching factory steam, before the eyes of an astonished public, condensed into tons of pure gold. However, in this historical formula of grand success, initially, like a genetic defect, there was embedded a mechanism of the dynasty's inevitable self-destruction, which would trigger with a deafening crash decades later. John Thompson Dorrance brilliantly proved to the world that water could be completely evaporated from a food product to create incredible, tangible material value. But no most genius chemist in human history has yet invented a reliable scientific way to evaporate weakness, greed, and arrogance from the souls of their own heirs. The vast wealth of the Dorrance dynasty was literally, physically forged from hard labor, the continuous clanging of factory conveyor belts, the acrid smell of boiled cabbage, and fanatical commercial thrift. This was honest, hard capital, thickly scented with workers' sweat and rusting iron. Capital entirely based on serving the mass, simple consumer, and it is precisely this fundamental, sacred foundation that his direct descendants will betray in the future with incredible aristocratic snobbery. The deep tragedy of third generations always lies in the catastrophic loss of historical memory. The grandchildren of the great inventor, who in 1989 will coldly decide the fate of the giant transnational corporation, will never in their lives see those dirty, noisy workshops in Camden where their grandfather choked on hot steam, personally mixing cheap tomatoes with salt. For them, the original source of their boundless power and dazzling luxury will become something infinitely distant, abstract, and frankly speaking, shameful. The more zeros appeared on the family's closed bank accounts, the more the heirs wanted to forever wash their manicured hands of non-existent phantom stains of tomato paste. Strict science, penny-pinching savings, and closeness to the simple working class, the very indestructible concrete pillars on which their golden throne firmly rested, will be disdainfully forgotten and discarded. Billions of small copper coins, meticulously collected from poor kitchen tables across the country, will turn into a blind instrument for creating an artificial, sterile American aristocracy. And this new aristocracy, having no slightest moral right to the high status of creators, will arrogantly decide that the only available way to prove their greatness is to cowardly hide from the real world behind impregnable stone walls, and forever forget where every paid-for brick in their luxurious Norman castle came from. In the history of forming great American fortunes, an inevitable turning, critical moment arrives when simple possession of an incredible amount of money becomes insufficient. When bank vaults are filled to bursting, an irresistible, sometimes painful need arises in corporate founders and their direct heirs to convert raw, industrial capital into something much more elegant and intangible, a flawless, unshakable social status. The Dorrance dynasty faced this harsh class reality head-on in the first half of the 20th century. Their financial assets multiplied in geometric progression, but in the snobbish, historically closed clubs of the East Coast of the United States of America, they were still arrogantly regarded as lucky upstarts. So-called old money, amassed a century earlier on global sea shipping, construction of transcontinental railroads, and banking speculations, disdainfully wrinkled their noses at the slightest mention of that name. The problem was that the Dorrance family's billions too obviously smelled of cheap tomato paste, boiled carrots, hot steam, and cold factory tin. The industrial triumph needed to be urgently washed clean of the ingrained factory soot. Soup money desperately demanded immediate legitimization in high society. It vitally needed a grand, dazzling facade that would forever erase the class boundary between mass canned goods traders and true aristocracy. And this monumental physical facade became the decision to build the Linden Hill estate. The construction of this architectural colossus in the elite, greenery-immersed Gladwin area of Pennsylvania was not a banal purchase of expensive country real estate. It was an aggressive, meticulously planned act of social conquest, an attempt to buy an entry ticket to the most privileged caste of American society for an astronomical sum. Famous architect Edmund Gilchrist received from the family a completely unprecedented commission to design not just a comfortable mansion, but to erect a real French Norman village right in the middle of the North American landscape. The choice of this specific style was deeply symbolic and psychologically calculated. French Normandy, on a subconscious level, is associated with hoary antiquity, knightly lineage, centuries-old traditions, and blood right to power. By erecting blind stone walls, majestic towers, and extensive inner courtyards, the Dorrance family as if rewrote their own genealogy, artificially aging their lineage. They cynically bought themselves a fictitious European past to erase from public memory their heavy industrial present. Every massive stone slab, every hand forged by blacksmith's iron decorative element in Linden Hill screamed of eternity, security, and immovability. This was a thunderous declaration to the whole world that henceforth the dynasty has nothing in common with the sweating workers at the vats in New Jersey, that now their rightful place is exclusively among lords and kings. Gradually, year after year, the Dorrance family's strategy acquired frightening features of manic social isolation. They physically and psychologically distanced themselves from the dirty, noisy production lines, forever relocating to a sterile, artificially created habitat. The deafening noise of conveyor belts, the clank of can openers, and the piercing horns of freight trains were replaced in their lives by the quiet rustle of leaves from centuries-old trees, the steady, soothing clop of thoroughbred stallions' hooves, and muffled, polite conversations in vast rooms paneled from floor to ceiling with the rarest wood species. This was not just a change of mailing address. It was a complete, conscious severing of the umbilical cord that connected the dynasty to harsh economic reality. They created their own, absolutely hermetic microcosm, a perfect and safe world whose entry was strictly forbidden to all who were even one step below them on the social ladder. Elitism became for them not just a comfortable lifestyle, but a true obsession, the most powerful protective mechanism against any reminder that the massive foundation of their French castle in reality rests on millions of cheap soup cans sold daily to the impoverished working class. Here lies a deep, ruthless, and irrefutable truth, brilliantly demonstrated by the anatomy of any decline. The thicker and higher the walls with which the elite barricades itself from the source of its wealth, the faster it loses connection with reality. The conversion of industrial capital into aristocratic status always carries within itself the destructive poison of slow action. The first generation creates colossal value, working knee-deep in dirt and soot, guided by the iron logic of survival. The second generation, having inherited this mighty empire, begins to suffer from a painful inferiority complex due to the plebeian origin of its money, and spends enormous resources on building castles, buying the illusion of ancient nobility. But the third generation, born already within these castles, sincerely believes that money does not come from the factory conveyor as a result of hard labor, but arises by itself, by some divine right of their elite birth. The further the Dorrance heirs distanced themselves from the smoking factories, the deeper they immersed themselves in the sterile luxury of Linden Hill, the more they went blind. They erected around themselves a flawless architectural illusion of old money, completely unaware that by cutting themselves off from the roots, they deprived their empire of vital juices. This synthetic, bought with canned soup aristocracy became their main historical curse, preparing the ground for a grand collapse. To fully comprehend the scale of the impending catastrophe, it is necessary to physically feel the space in which those who will ultimately destroy the legacy of the great chemist grew up. The Linden Hill estate was not just a very large and incredibly expensive house. It represented a complex, multi-level psychological labyrinth built from cold stone and dark wood. Imagine 50 acres of land, hidden from prying eyes behind a dense, impenetrable wall of tall trees. When the heavy wrought iron gates slowly, with dignity, opened, an untypical landscape for America appeared before the few admitted guests. The huge architectural complex was designed to suppress any manifestation of individuality, forcing every person to feel like a tiny grain of sand before the greatness of the dynasty. The monumental stone facades, built in the strict style of a French Norman village, did not flirt with the surrounding nature, but aggressively dominated it. Pointed towers with viewing windows, as if transported from medieval Europe, pierced the Pennsylvania sky, conveying a single harsh idea. This is not just a private residence. This is a fortified citadel, an impregnable stronghold created to protect its inhabitants from any external threats. Each architectural detail of this estate was deeply symptomatic and exposed the hidden fears of its owners. Spacious inner courtyards were perfectly paved with stone, creating an enclosed, safe space where there was no room for accidents. The grounds featured not only residential buildings, but also rebuilt, historically precise barns, an elegant poultry yard, and classic dovecotes. However, these structures had nothing in common with real farming. They were merely expensive theatrical scenery, an artificial imitation of the noble, pastoral life of European feudal lords. The interior furnishings of the house were even more eloquent. Moving from room to room, you as if traversed the halls of a gigantic museum dedicated to human vanity. Huge, Overwhelming in their massiveness, stone fireplaces, in which a whole tree could easily be burned, symbolized the eternal, unquenchable family hearth of the Dorances. Complex, hand-carved wooden wall paneling absorbed sounds, creating in the rooms an atmosphere of ringing, almost sepulchral silence. The intricate layout of corridors, hidden passages, and numerous enfilades formed a sense of absolute isolation from the outside world. Every door handle, every step on the oak staircases literally screamed of a manic desire for eternity and security, of a striving to forever freeze time within these walls. Here lies the most important architectural metaphor explaining the inevitability of this empire's fall. Ask yourself, from whom exactly was the Dorrance family barricading itself behind these colossal Norman walls? They were hiding not from robbers and not from competitors in the canning business. At the deepest psychological level, they were barricading themselves from reality, from the dirty, tomato-scented truth about the source of their billions. The house was designed as an indestructible family nest for centuries, as an ark meant to carry their artificial aristocracy through generations. But the greatest mistake of the Linden Hill creators lay in the fact that they confused security with isolation. They built the perfect incubator for breeding the elite, not understanding that in an absolutely sterile environment, social immunity completely atrophies. Within the walls of this Norman castle, the third generation of the dynasty grew up. People who perceived this stunning luxury as a natural habitat, as an unconditional given requiring no effort to maintain. For them, these towers and fireplaces were not a symbol of their grandfather's grand scientific and financial triumph, but simply a very expensive backdrop to their daily life. In the end, the monumental architectural masterpiece, conceived as a symbol of absolute, indestructible power, turned into something completely opposite. Linden Hill became a golden cage, a luxurious but completely detached from life reservation in which the Heirs' will slowly degenerated. When external threats were completely eliminated by the thickness of the stone walls, destructive energy began to accumulate within the family. This is the classic paradox of any isolated system. A house built to unite and protect the dynasty from external attacks inevitably becomes the main cause of its internal disintegration. Luxurious living rooms, where strategic decisions about the company's future were supposed to be made, soon turned into battlefields for fratricidal conflicts. Majestic French interiors, meant to inspire awe and respect, became merely a list of expensive lots in future lawsuits and divorce proceedings. Linden Hill, the architectural embodiment of the dream of eternity, in reality turned out to be a luxurious sarcophagus in which the original, creative energy of the great chemist John Thompson Dorrance was buried alive. The illusion of the impregnability of the Norman castle shattered to pieces, not under the blows of siege weapons, but in the silence of a luxurious bedroom. In April 1989, John Jack Dorrance Jr. died. The death of the patriarch did not just stop the heart of a specific man, it knocked out the cornerstone from the gigantic, complex architectural vault on which the entire empire rested. While Jack was alive, his absolute dictatorial control over the share of stock amounting to more than 58% of the company guaranteed external calm and corporate stability. He was the last living link connecting the colossal wealth with the memory of how it was created. But when the will was read, this monolithic block of power cracked, and the decisive percentages fell into the hands of numerous children and nephews. The heirs, raised in the sterile, perfect isolation of Linden Hill, were no longer united by a common goal. The father's authority no longer restrained them. For the first time in decades, they gained real, tangible power over their own fate, and the fate of the giant corporation. And at that moment, the terrible truth was revealed. They had absolutely nothing in common, except the surname and a manic desire to control vast sums of money. The family swiftly, with frightening cruelty, divided into two irreconcilable camps, exposing the deepest moral conflict. On one side of the barricades stood the Loyalists, led by Mary Alice Dorrance Malone. For her, raised among Norman towers, the shares of Campbell Soup were not just faceless financial assets. She saw in them something sacred, a blood legacy of her great-grandfather, irrefutable proof of the family's historical significance. Her motivation was imbued with a sentimental, almost religious desire to preserve the business's independence, to keep the empire in family hands at any cost, as a tribute to the past. But on the other side of the front, with cold calculation and undisguised aggression, the dissenters stepped forward. This faction was led by Mary Alice's brother, John Dorrance III, along with a group of influential cousins. Unlike his sister, John III harbored no romantic illusions about his grandfather's canned soup tins. He looked at the red and white logo and saw only one thing: astronomical liquidity locked in the shares. For him, the empire was merely a giant sack of money that needed to be immediately ripped open and divided. The dissenters demanded the urgent sale of the company, insisting on converting the historical legacy into billions in cash to finally free themselves from any family obligations. In this schism lies the deepest philosophical layer, exposing the very essence of the problem of inheriting colossal capital. Ask yourself, what inevitably happens to people who, by right of birth, inherited enormous, almost boundless power, but did not inherit a drop of the iron discipline, fanatical hard work, and intellectual might that originally created that power? The answer is terrifying in its simplicity. They begin to perceive that power as a burden or as a tool for immediate gratification of their own selfish desires. For John Dorrance III and his supporters, the company that had fed them their entire lives was not a lifelong endeavor, but an obstacle on the path to absolute financial freedom. They grew up in the greenhouse conditions of Linden Hill, where every desire of theirs was fulfilled before they could even voice it. Their capacity for creation had completely atrophied. Only a thirst for consumption remained. They did not want to manage the company. They wanted to cash it out. In their worldview, selling the family business was not a betrayal of their chemist grandfather's legacy, but a logical, pragmatic financial decision. The clash of these two opposing worldviews within one luxurious castle was inevitably bound to lead to catastrophe. The family's personal tragedy of losing their father instantly transformed into a cold, ruthless war for control over billions. Mary Alice desperately tried to preserve the historical illusion, clinging to the past, while John III cynically demanded monetizing the present, utterly unconcerned with the future. The foundation laid by the genius scientist in the stuffy factory workshops of New Jersey tore apart with a deafening crack in the elegant living rooms of Linden Hill. The children, raised in absolute, unattainable luxury, could not agree on how to divide the wealth because they had never known how it was created. Their conflict became the brightest proof that money, even in the most astronomical amounts, cannot hold a family together if the spirit of creation has forever vanished from it. The Norman castle, created for eternity, became the arena of a brutal intra-species struggle where the heirs prepared to tear each other's throats out for the right to finally destroy the work of their great-grandfather. What began as tense, restrained whispers in the luxurious living rooms of Linden Hill very soon burst beyond the bounds of the estate's wrought iron gates and turned into a grand, unprecedented public scandal. The Great Soup War, as journalists instantly dubbed it, splashed onto the front pages of America's leading financial publications. The massive crisis took on the forms of a true corporate bloodbath. The dissenters, led by John Dorrance III, launched an open attack, demanding the dismemberment and sale of the empire.
The Loyalists, rallied around Mary Alice, defended with the desperation of the doomed, trying to block any attempts at sale. The board of directors of the Campbell Soup Company turned into a battlefield where every vote was worth its weight in gold, and family ties were used exclusively as weapons for blackmail and pressure. The market reacted instantly and ruthlessly. Stock prices began to plummet catastrophically. Investors panicked and dumped shares, watching as the once unshakable monopolist crumbled before their eyes due to a banal family quarrel. Endless lawsuits began, mutual accusations of incompetence, and dirty intrigues worthy of the lowest soap operas. Analyzing this process, one cannot fail to be struck by the absolute clinical absurdity of what was happening. The family that had maniacally hidden behind impenetrable Norman walls for decades. The family that spent astronomical sums to maintain the image of a flawless, closed aristocracy, now shamelessly aired its dirty laundry in front of the entire country. They litigated for the right to become even richer billionaires, completely unaware that in the process of this fratricidal war, they risked destroying the very company that fed them. This was a clash of two irreconcilable ideologies: legacy versus liquidity. Mary Alice saw the company as a sacred monument that needed to be protected. John III saw it merely as a giant ATM that had broken and wouldn't dispense cash on demand. In the pursuit of absolute control and immediate monetization, the heirs completely lost their instinct for self-preservation, forgetting the main rule of capital. Money loves silence, and the public hysterics of the elite are always paid for out of shareholders' pockets. Here we encounter the deepest psychological phenomenon characteristic of the late stages of great fortune's existence. Why are people whose financial future is secured for 10 generations ahead ready to tear their own brothers and sisters apart in courtrooms? The answer lies in the destructive nature of wealth itself, deprived of creative meaning. For the grandchildren of John Thompson Dorrance, these billions were not the result of their own labor or intellectual effort. They were their inalienable birthright, their sole identity. When John III demanded the sale of the company, he demanded not just money. He demanded absolute, unrestricted freedom from the heavy burden of family responsibility. When Mary Alice resisted the sale, she was protecting not so much business processes as the illusion of her family's significance in the historical context. They did not understand that true power lies not in the number of zeros on a bank account, but in the ability to create value. Having lost this ability, they turned into hostages of their own capital. Their corporate war was not a struggle for survival, but a repulsive battle of vanities, where each wanted to prove their rightness, even if the price of that victory would be ashes. In the end, the Loyalists miraculously held on to control. Campbell Soup was not sold and retained its independence. But this victory was bitter and destructive. The Dorrance dynasty was split forever, without the slightest hope of reconciliation. John Dorrance III, who lost the battle, unable to endure the public humiliation and unwilling to reconcile with defeat, committed an act that became the apotheosis of this tragedy. He publicly renounced his United States citizenship to avoid paying taxes on his remaining assets, and moved to Ireland permanently. This démarche became the final symbolic break with that very country, with that very working class that once bought his grandfather's cheap canned goods and made his family one of the richest in the world.
the grandson of the genius scientist preferred to become an exile with billions in his pocket, rather than remain in the shadow of the great legacy that he could neither understand nor fully monetize. The corporate bloodbath ended, but it left behind scorched earth, destroyed family ties, and the grand Norman castle of Linden Hill, which now stood empty and lifeless, like a gigantic, unwanted monument to human greed. The dense crowns of centuries-old trees in Gladwin still sway steadily in the wind, but the heavy wrought-iron gates of the Linden Hill estate no longer conceal the secrets of a great dynasty. They stand wide open, allowing streams of cars to enter, filled with complete strangers. The mansion is up for public sale. What was once conceived as an impregnable fortress, as the sacred altar of the Dorrance family's elitism, has now turned into a banal, albeit astronomically expensive, listing on the elite real estate market. On the flawless French marble, which remembers the quiet steps of the heirs to a vast empire, now echo the loud clicks of the heels of indifferent appraisers, realtors, and potential buyers. They brazenly enter the vast halls, run their fingers over the unique wooden wall paneling, peer into the bottomless stone fireplaces, and assess the height of the Norman towers exclusively in square feet and potential market value. This is the physical, tangible disintegration of the dynasty, put on public display. Strangers' cold gazes glide over those very rooms where the fates of the transnational corporation were recently decided, and where brothers and sisters ruthlessly tore apart their grandfather's legacy. The castle did not fall under the assault of an enemy army. It was humiliatingly consigned to the archives of history, under the bang of an auctioneer's gavel. The elegant poultry yard, dovecotes, and 50 acres of land pass into the hands of new owners, for whom the surname of the concentrated soup creators means absolutely nothing. In this auction of vanity lies the deepest and most transcendent irony of our entire history, drawing a ruthless conclusion to the decades-long pursuit of status. The genius chemist John Thomson Dorrance accomplished a true industrial revolution when he realized that heavy water was a superfluous element. He evaporated the water from ordinary soup to create a pure, dense concentrate, a product capable of being stored indefinitely, easily transported over any distances, and generating phenomenal profit. He created absolute commercial value through ruthless elimination of the superfluous. But by the cruel mockery of fate, his own grandchildren performed the exact opposite destructive process. They failed to preserve the pure concentrate of family values, iron discipline, and respect for creative labor on which their empire rested. Instead, they diluted this thick legacy with the icy water of their personal greed, laziness, and endless claims against each other. The brilliant scientist placed financial eternity into a tiny red and white tin can, making it a symbol of American prosperity, while his descendants took that eternity and senselessly splashed it across the halls of courtrooms, leaving behind only empty, lifeless walls of a French village in the middle of North America. Why is this story about the food industry, billions, and a destroyed mansion so frighteningly relevant today? Because it shatters to pieces one of the most dangerous myths of modern capitalist society. The great illusion that vast fortunes can unite generations and guarantee a family historical immortality. We are accustomed to looking at lists of the world's richest people with admiration, assuming that passing on colossal capital by inheritance automatically means passing on greatness. But the anatomy of the Dorrance dynasty's fall irrefutably proves the opposite. Money, deprived of its original meaning and severed from the process of its creation, turns into the most toxic substance on earth. Capital that is obtained for free and perceived as an unconditional birthright does not unite family members. It ruthlessly isolates them from each other, completely burning out the capacity for empathy, compromise, and awareness of shared duty. When the third generation forgets the acrid smell of factory steam and the sharp click of the can opener, when it begins to sincerely believe that their aristocratic status arose by itself, the empire is doomed to self-destruction. Today, the red and white can of condensed soup still stands on the shelf in virtually every grocery store in the world. It costs mere pennies, and millions of ordinary people buy it daily, without suspecting what colossal Shakespearean drama hides behind this familiar geometric label design. And far away in Pennsylvania rise the cold stone towers of the Linden Hill estate. These are two inseparable poles of one tragedy. The cheapest food, which created the most arrogant billionaires, and the flawless architectural luxury that ultimately destroyed their family. John Thompson Dorrance wanted to cheaply feed the working class, and along the way built a mechanism capable of generating wealth for centuries. But he overlooked the main law of human nature. Even the strongest and most expensive castle will not withstand if its own inhabitants decide to dismantle the foundation brick by brick for immediate cashing out. This story will remain an eternal, stern warning that true legacy is measured not by the number of zeros in trust accounts, but by the values passed on to heirs. And if those values are empty, no wrought iron gates or marble halls will save the dynasty from inevitable oblivion.